All right, class, let's continue our discussion on Chapter 4 of Human Biology as we discuss the integumentary system. As we look at our integumentary system, this is a system that is both going to consist of our skin, in a general term, and when most people think of the integumentary system, they think of our body's skin. But in addition to the skin, it also includes our hair, our fingernails, our toenails, and our glands of our skins. Oh, we can think of our sweat glands, our oil glands, or our aka the sudoriferous and sebaceous glands. And then there's some other sensory organs as well that are part of our integumentary system. As we look at our skin, the skin has two main regions to it. One is on the surface, known as the epidermis, and then there's the deeper living layer, known as the dermis. The epidermis is generally referred to as a non-living layer of the skin, whereas the dermis is the deeper living layer of our skin. And then underneath the skin is the subcutaneous layer, sometimes also referred to as the hypodermis. The subcutaneous or hypodermic layer is between the dermis and the internal organs or internal structures of our body. Generally speaking, in our subcutaneous layer or hypodermic layer, we store our superficial body fat. So there's lots of adipose tissue within that subcutaneous layer. This integumentary system, or generally speaking, our skin, is very important for maintaining homeostasis. It helps us keep fluids in our bodies, helps us to regulate our body heat, helps to keep pathogens from getting into our body, or helps to keep bacteria and viruses from getting into our body. So this helps our skin, our integumentary system, helps us to maintain a relatively constant internal environment. It helps us to maintain homeostasis. So it looks like I was getting a little bit ahead of myself right there. Our skin helps helps to regulate our body temperature. We have sensory receptors that we use to monitor our external environment in our skin. These can be both pressure, light touch, deep touch. We also have temperature receptors that we use to regulate our body temperature. We use our skin to help synthesize vitamin D and pigments, skin pigments such as melanin, and our skin physically protects us from physical trauma. We have that tough epidermis that resists abrasion and then also makes it difficult for bacteria and other microorganisms to get into our body and helps us to retain body fluids. If we look at our skin, the two main regions, as I mentioned before, are the dermis and the epidermis. The epidermis is superficial and the dermis is deeper. The epidermis is that outermost layer, and that epidermis is made of epithelial tissues, whereas the dermis is going to be made of connective tissues. The uppermost layers of the epidermis are dead tissues. They've been completely filled with a tough protein. That tough protein is called keratin. In addition to being very tough, it's also waterproof as well. If we go back a slide here, you can see that there are many, many layers of flattened cells on the surface of the epidermis filled with keratin. So we have a stratified squamous epithelium. So the dermis is made of epithelial tissues, particularly stratified squamous epithelial tissues. Within our epidermis, we have Langerhans cells. Langerhans cells are a special kind of white blood cells that moves through the epidermis and helps to remove pathogens or microorganisms that could potentially hurt us. We also have melanocytes. A melanocyte in our epidermis is a special kind of cell that makes skin pigment. The skin pigment we refer to is the melanin pigment. So a melanocyte is a cell that makes melanin. We use melanin to help prevent or help protect our bodies from ultraviolet damage or ultraviolet light. It also colors our skin. Some noteworthy things about the melanocytes include the fact that whether you have very fair or light colored skin or very dark colored skin, you typically, from human to human to human, have the same number of melanocytes in each individual. The difference between somebody who has fair skin or light colored skin and someone who has dark colored skin is how active the melanocytes are within their bodies. Individuals of sub-Saharan African descent, generally speaking, have very active melanocytes in their skin, whereas individuals whose ancestors are native to above 45 degrees latitude, so think Russia, think Canada, those individuals, or Scandinavia, those individuals have very inactive or unactive melanocytes. Our epidermis also is going to have some cells that we use to convert cholesterol into vitamin D, which is then going to be further processed by the liver, and that processing will be finished in the liver for our vitamin D production. Our dermis is the layer beneath the epidermis. It's a thick layer that's living. It's made of dense fibrous connective tissues. It has many blood vessels. It has many different elastic and collagen fibers. Let's back up 2 slides here. This lighter pink layer from right here where the mouse is all the way down to right here, this whole layer with all of these blood vessels and different structures and accessory organs is the dermis. Our dermis has many sensory receptors, some for light touch, some for deep pressure, some for hot, some for cold, some for pain. It's also going to contain hair follicles and contain secretory glands. If we look at this cross section of the skin underneath in a light microscope, and actually I don't think this is a light micrograph because this is really high resolution. I think this is an electron micrograph based on the resolution shown here. So ignore that caption right there. I'm saying electron micrograph based on the incredibly high resolution. We can see that in the epidermis, because this has been falsely colored, that these cells in the epidermis are starting to be filled with keratin, but once they're fully filled with keratin, those cells can start to slough off and be more flaky. And those fully keratinized cells will be dead and on the surface of our epidermis. Related to our skin is a very common condition known as skin cancer. There are multiple kinds of skin cancers in our body. 3 of them arise in the epidermis. We're going to focus on 2 of them. One is basal cell carcinoma and the other is melanoma. Basal cell carcinoma is the most common kind of skin cancer. It arises in the deepest layer of the epidermis, but thankfully it's the least deadly. So it has the highest cure rate, even though it has the highest incident rate. And then we're also going to talk about the deadliest kind of skin cancer, melanoma. If a melanocyte starts to form those tumors, that will be a melanoma, and that melanoma is the deadliest kind of skin cancer. But thankfully, it's the least common kind. How can we prevent skin cancer? You can avoid lots of intense sunlight. So stay out of the sun during the midday when it's the brightest. You can wear protective clothing, so wear clothes that prevent you from being exposed to sunlight. You can have a wide-brimmed hat. You can wear sunglasses. You can have long sleeves, pants. That sunscreen that you use should be at least SPF 15, and most sunscreen is SPF 15. In addition, most makeup is SPF 15. To give you an idea, just wearing a t-shirt, generally speaking, is going to give you that minimum SPF 15 protection over the portions of your body covered by your t-shirt. That sunscreen factor, or sun protectant factor, should be at least 15, and that sunscreen should prevent UVA and UVB, both high and low frequency ultraviolet radiation, from being in our bodies. Also, don't fake bake. Avoid the use of tanning beds. If you really need to have an artificial tan, go ahead and use some of that artificial tanning lotion that contains chemicals that stimulate the melanocytes, or get a spray tan. Here are some skin cancers that you'll see commonly. So here's that basal cell carcinoma. If it's peely, flaky, and crusty, and irregularly shaped, 3-dimensionally shaped, and multicolored, that's a big red flag that it's a skin cancer. And then here's a melanoma. This melanoma is, again, irregularly shaped. We have light brown, dark brown. There's some 3-dimensionality to this. This is a very dangerous kind of skin cancer that spreads very, very rapidly throughout the body. If we look at some of the accessory organs of our integumentary system, they can include our fingernails and toenails. Those nails start in the epidermis and give us a protective covering for the distal ends, the far ends of our digits, the far ends of our toes and our fingers. We have hair follicles. Hair follicles start in the dermis, but the hair will grow through the epidermis to the surface of our body. We have oil glands, also known as sebaceous glands, and these oil glands produce sebum, which is mostly lipids. It's going to consist mostly of phospholipids. And the sebum will lubricate our skin and help reduce the amount of bacterial growth on the surface of our body. And then finally we have sweat glands, also known as sudoriferous glands. And these sweat glands are going to help determine our body temperature. As we overheat, our body will start to sweat, and that sweat can reduce our body temperature. There are 2 different kinds of sweat glands, apocrine and the acrine and the eccrine sweat glands. And these sweat glands are generally referred to as the ones that cover our entire body and are watery or have serous secretions. And then the other kind are going to be located in just the armpits and the urogenital area. And those sweat glands, that second kind that are in the armpits and the urogenital area, generally speaking, are activated during puberty. So, concept check class. Is the skin a membrane, an organ, or both? And tell me why. Let's say it's a membrane because it forms a barrier that protects us from the outside environment. Or you could say B, it's an organ because it's made of two or more tissue types working together. Specifically, fibrous connective tissue, dense fibrous connective tissue, and stratified squamous tissue, epithelial tissue. Or C, both, because the explanations for A and B are both correct. So, pause this video, rewind it, check your notes, check your textbook, get me an answer. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The correct answer is C, both the skin is a membrane and an organ for the reasons explained. So, let's continue on as we move from tissues to organs and organ systems. An organ, generally speaking, is going to be two or more tissues working together for a particular function. And an organ system is two or more organs working together for a particular function. So we're noticing a pattern here. If we have two or more organ systems, then we have the organism. So let's talk about some of the organ systems of the body. Actually, these organ systems include the integumentary system. So we have our skin, hair, and nails. We've already talked about that in detail in this recording. We have the cardiovascular system that's involved with pumping blood throughout the body and transporting nutrients and waste. We have the lymphatic/immune system, which is involved in fighting infection. We have the digestive system, which helps us to break down and absorb nutrients. We have the respiratory system, which helps us have gas exchange in our body. The urinary system helps us to filter our blood and remove waste products from our blood. Our skeletal system is going to support and protect our bodies. Our muscular system is going to support, protect, and move our bodies. Our nervous system allows for integration of information, to process information in our bodies. We have fast information transfer in our nervous system, and our endocrine system allows for a very slow information transfer. So the hormones of our body are going to be in the endocrine system and will communicate very much slower than the tissues of the nervous system, which communicate very quickly, almost instantaneously. And then we have the reproductive system, which, as its name implies, involves reproduction and involves making babies or the progeny or the next generation. So those are our organ systems. Let's talk about our body cavities. We have multiple body cavities. Some of those body cavities are going to be smaller cavities within larger cavities. And we've already talked about these body cavities briefly, but we're going to spend some more time talking about them. We have the dorsal cavity, which is broken down into the cranial or brain cavity, and then the vertebral or spinal cord cavity. Then we have the ventral cavity. The ventral cavity is the largest body cavity, and it can be broken down into the thoracic/chest cavity. Then we have the abdominal and pelvic cavities, which are also part of the ventral cavity. Oftentimes the abdominal and the pelvic cavities are combined and referred to as the abdominal pelvic cavity. Sometimes it can just be referred to as the peritoneal cavity as well. That's another term for that. These body cavities have a double membrane that lines them, a serous membrane that lines them. The double membrane that lines the thoracic cavity that's in the thoracic cavity. There's multiple double membranes in the thoracic cavity. One is going to line the subcavity that has the lungs. That is the pleural cavity. We also have the pericardial cavity, which goes around our heart. So both the pleural and pericardial cavities are subcavities within the thoracic cavity, and they have a pleural membrane and a pericardial membrane. We also have a membrane that lines the abdominal pelvic cavity. That membrane, or that lines the peritoneal cavity, that is known as the peritoneum membrane. So we have three serous membranes emphasized here. We have the pleural serous membrane, the pericardial serous membrane, and the peritoneal serous membrane. We also have lots of mucous membranes. These mucous membranes, generally speaking, are going to line any part of our body that's exposed to the external environment. So the respiratory tracts, the tubes of the urinary tract, and then the tubes of the reproductive systems. And these mucous membranes aid in both lubrication and protection. Our serous membranes that line the cavities I talked about on this slide, the pleural, peritoneal, and pericardial cavities, are going to cover both the internal organs and are going to cover the cavity walls themselves. Now, the pericardial cavity is commonly misconstrued to be the cavity that contains the heart. It is not the cavity that contains the heart. It's the cavity that goes around the surface of the heart. Peri means around the perimeter. Pericardium is a cavity that goes, or a membrane that goes around the perimeter of the heart, but doesn't contain the heart directly. That's a separate cavity known as the mediastinum cavity. The peritoneal cavity refers to the abdominal pelvic cavity, and then the pleural cavity contains the lungs. We also have some membranes that are going to line our joints. Those are the synovial membranes that lie freely movable joints. And our synovial membranes make a lubricating fluid known as synovial fluid. You can think of synovial fluid quite literally as elbow grease. It's what lubricates your elbow and the other major joints of your body. Lining our central nervous system, so our brain and our spinal cord, we have a series of membranes known as meninges. And these meninges have 3 different layers to them. The dura mater, the pia mater, the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and then the pia mater, from outside to inside. And those are going to help protect our brain and spinal cord from the other environments in our bodies. So, concept check, class. Which of the following is the largest body cavities? The dorsal, ventral, thoracic, or the abdominal pelvic cavities? Go ahead and rewind the video, or you can check your notes and or textbook to get me an answer. Pause it and get me an answer right now. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The correct answer is ventral cavity. Our ventral cavity is this large cavity that consists of the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavities. So B, ventral, is the correct answer. And let's continue on and talk about homeostasis. Homeostasis is this idea that we can maintain a relatively constant internal environment in our body. So our body temperature can increase a little bit, it can decrease a little bit, but we're always going to hover around a preset body temperature. Or we can always hover around a preset oxygen concentration, or a preset blood pH. There are many different variables that are controlled in our body. Each variable or environmental condition on the inside of our body needs to stay about the same. And this process of keeping all the conditions in our body about the same is referred to as homeostasis. So static means same, or stationary, and homeo means same. Homeo means same. So we can have a little bit of change in our bodies from those normal tolerance limits, but if we have a medium to high change, we can either have a disease state set in for a medium change. So if your body temperature hits 102 degrees Fahrenheit or 39 degrees Celsius, that'll be illness. But if you hit 44 degrees Celsius or like 10 degrees Fahrenheit, that would be death. So very small changes, like a degree or 2 in body temperature, are no big deal. Medium changes of like 2 to 4 degrees can make you sick, and then larger changes of 10 degrees will kill you. All of our body systems work together to maintain homeostasis. Homeostasis is one of those unifying themes in human anatomy and physiology. It's a class-wide conceptual theme that I emphasize during every one of my human physiology presentations. Our nervous system will quickly communicate between body systems of our body. Our cardiovascular system will transport nutrients. Our digestive system adds nutrients. Our muscular system will help us move to change our environments to maintain homeostasis. Think about when you're outside and you're really cold, you can walk inside to where it's warmer. Our endocrine system will slowly communicate information across our body for long-term periods of time. Our respiratory system is going to aid with blood gas and blood pH. Our urinary system helps to remove body waste from our blood and to maintain fluid volume. Our lymphatic system aids with fluid volumes or fluid retention and to help us fight infection. And our integumentary system helps to maintain body temperature, fluid volumes, and fight infection. There are 2 ways that we can maintain homeostasis. We have negative feedback and we have positive feedback. Negative feedback generally means that the response is opposite from the stimulus. So let's talk about body temperature, the classic example of negative feedback. Let's say that we are too warm. And if we're too warm, that's the stimulus. Our body temperature is going up. Our brain senses that, processes that information, and then causes us to sweat. And then once we start to sweat, our body temperature goes back down. So the response is body temperature goes down, and that lowering our body temperature is a response to an increase in body temperature, negative feedback. Or we could say we're too cold, and if we're too cold, our brain can sense that and then cause us to start shivering to increase our body temperature. Positive feedback is much rarer in our body. Most of our feedback loops are negative in nature. Our positive feedback loops are much harder to find. The response is the same as the stimulus. Can you imagine how much trouble we would be in if we had positive feedback for our body temperature? If in response to being cold, what if your body sweated so that you get even colder? That would not be good. These positive feedback loops are few and far between because they can spiral out of control very quickly. Classic examples of positive feedback include blood clotting, uterine contractions, moving electrical signals across cells. Let's look at negative or any feedback loop in general. Any generic feedback loop is going to contain a sensor, an integration or control sensor, and an effect sensor. So we're going to first start off with the stimulus that's picked up by the sensor. That sensor will then send information to the control center. Usually that's done via the nervous system, so our sensory nerves will send information to the brain and spinal cord where it's processed. Then the brain and spinal cord make a decision and send a signal to some kind of muscular cell, smooth cardiac or skeletal muscle cell, to cause a response. And then if it's negative feedback, we try to go back to the original level. So we already talked about body temp and negative feedback. Let's talk about positive feedback in more detail. Positive feedback is going to magnify or amplify changes that are in our environment. I mentioned uterine contractions. Oxytocin causes a uterine contraction. If the uterus contracts, that releases oxytocin, which causes even more uterine contractions. And as anyone who's ever been pregnant can tell you, usually when labor starts, the uterine contractions are slow, weak, and few and far in between. But as you go from pre-labor to active labor, uterine contractions become more frequent, more powerful, and stronger because we are amplifying a signal with this positive feedback loop. Positive feedback loops can be very harmful for us, particularly when it comes to body temperature issues, where we enter a fever state and then continue to amplify our body temperature in the fever state. So, concept check class. What kind of feedback have I described in this scenario? So, I eat lots of chocolate because I feel bad, even though it causes me to gain weight. And I feel bad because I am overweight. Is this a negative feedback loop where I'm moving back towards an original value or set predetermined value? Or is this a positive feedback loop where I'm amplifying something, where I'm amplifying a signal? Or can you not tell based on the information given? Go ahead and pause the video, check your notes, check your textbook, and get me an answer. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The correct answer is A, positive feedback loop. In this scenario, this individual is eating chocolate and becoming more overweight. And as they become more overweight, they feel increasingly bad about themselves and eat increasing amounts of chocolate, becoming even more overweight. So the cycle is amplifying itself in this situation. That's a positive feedback loop. A negative feedback loop would be, I work out, I exercise a lot because I feel bad, and I feel bad because I gain weight, because I've gained weight. But I didn't say that. I said I eat lots of chocolate and it's causing me to gain weight, and I feel bad because I gain weight. So that's this amplification. And that amplifying of a signal is going to be a positive feedback loop. That's all we have on this presentation, and we covered a lot of different topics. We had the integumentary system, we had membranes, and we had homeostasis. And we also had body systems in general. So wow, this was a meaty presentation. We had a lot of breadth to this presentation. If you have any questions for me about the content, please feel free to ask me when you're on campus, shoot me an email, or post them to the discussion boards. Happy studies!